In this lecture, we're going to continue our discussion of other topics in labor economics, and in particular, we're going to talk about the economics of discrimination. And just to give you a little bit more summary of what we're going to talk about, the first thing we're going to talk about is some difficulties that arise when measuring discrimination and trying to figure out exactly how much of the difference in wages between different groups is due to discrimination versus due to other factors. And I'm going to give you some examples of how economists have developed clever ways to measure the extent of discrimination in certain instances, and I think you might find some of these examples pretty interesting. And then lastly, we're going to talk about a situation when the market forces might solve the problem of discrimination, and some other situations in which the market might not solve or even exacerbate discrimination. So, what exactly do we mean by discrimination in this particular context? So, what we mean is offering different opportunities to individuals who differ only by some characteristic: race, ethnicity, gender, something else. And this is a different offering of opportunities that, again, should not be related to the value of the marginal product of the worker. So that's really what we're trying to measure here. So we have two workers. They are the exact same in terms of background and education. Just one either happens to be a woman and one is a man, or one is a white worker, another is African American. And this is what we're trying to measure. So you probably remember from the last lecture that when we looked at the earnings of all of those different occupations, we saw gender wage gaps in all of those occupations. And they were about 20% for most of the occupations. So if you look at the gender wage gap, males earn about 20% more than females. And you can also look at a race wage gap. So white males earn about 25% more than black males. So the question is all of this difference due to discrimination? Is some of it due to other factors? And if so, how much? So why might these differences not be due to discrimination? Well, think about other characteristics that might be different between males and females, and other characteristics that might be different between a white worker versus a black worker. So what might some of these differences be? Well, if you look at white workers compared to black workers, white workers have, on average, more education. And that education is not only in terms of a college degree, it's also in terms of a graduate degree. And if you looked at males versus females, women often have less on-the-job experience than men. And if we looked at public schools in predominantly black areas versus predominantly white areas, public schools tend to be of lower quality. So then perhaps it's not discrimination at the labor market level. Maybe it's discrimination at an earlier stage of life. And this is particularly relevant for the race wage gap. So if black workers accumulate less human capital, not because they are not as smart as white workers, but because their schools are of lower quality, then that could explain at least part of the wage gap. So this is why it's difficult to measure labor market discrimination. We have all of these other things going on. And I think that most economists would agree that there is most definitely discrimination going on in the labor market. but how much of that 25% difference between black and white workers is due to discrimination versus how much of it is due to other factors, I'm not sure that we've been able to convincingly measure that yet. And the same thing with the gender wage gap. So now I'm going to go over three studies that really have stuck with me, where economists have come up with very convincing evidence that discrimination actually exists in different labor markets. So the first one is a study by Bertrand and Mullinayan, and what they did was set up something akin to a science experiment. So they sent 5,000 fake resumes to employers that were looking to hire people, and these resumes were identical except for some of them had names that were common among African Americans, like Lakeisha or Jamal, and the other half of the resumes had names that were common among white workers, Emily, Greg, and so on and so forth. And what they found is that the white names received 50% more calls from interested employers than black names. And what's important to keep in mind here is that the only thing that was different among these resumes was a name that signaled that the potential employee was black versus a name that signaled that the potential employee is white. So what is really nice about this study is that, again, it's like a science experiment. It removes everything else from the equation aside from the race of the employee. So exact same educational backgrounds. The potential employer has the exact same information about each employee. The only thing that's different is the name. So if you're interested in the slides, I have one of the main tables from the paper here, and you can look and see some of the more detailed findings that they had. So the way that you'd want to compare these is you see that we have white females versus African American females. So you can compare the percent callbacks for the different names for white females versus the percent callbacks for African American females, and then you can see that the white females on average got much higher callbacks than African American females. And you can see the same thing for white males versus African American males. So this study was a huge bombshell when it was published, and there's actually been a lot of studies that have replicated this general study framework. Another one of the studies that I found particularly compelling was measuring discrimination in the NBA. So you might think, why do we care about measuring discrimination in the NBA? Well, what's really nice about this is in sports we can see really clear measures of how productive each worker is. So you can go to various websites and download play-by-play NBA data for the past number of years, and you can see exactly how productive each player is. And what these guys did is they looked at the rate at which players had fouls called against them when they were officiated by a referee officiating crew that was comprised of people of their own race versus people of the opposite race. And they found that more fouls are called against players when they are officiated by an opposite race officiating crew. And this difference is large enough so that they can affect a decent number of games. So why do I think that this is a really good study? Well, for statistical reasons that you don't need to concern yourselves with yet, the study is very convincingly done. And again, when you're using sports data, you can control for how productive each player is at a very, very detailed level. So this is, I think, very convincing evidence. And what else is, I think, very convincing here is if there was an arena where I would not expect to see discrimination, it would be referees in sports. I mean, every call that they make is so highly scrutinized that, you know, if there was a large amount of discrimination, they would have a lot of reasons to get rid of it and people would notice it. So the fact that it exists even in this instance, I think, is strong evidence that it exists in a lot of other areas where the discrimination may not be as visible to outside forces. So continuing with sports, we have Major League Baseball. So what these guys did is they looked at when Major League Baseball umpires call strikes versus balls, and they were able to come up with an objective measure of when a pitch should be called a ball versus a strike, using that little strike versus ball rectangle that you can see when you watch baseball on TV. So they could compare the umpire's calls to what this box thing suggested the umpire should have called. And here again, they find that strikes are called less often if the umpire and the pitcher do not match race and ethnicity. And they then find that pitchers understand that umpires will be biased in their calls of strikes against them, and they change the way that they pitch. And because pitchers change the way that they pitch, that means that pitchers of different ethnicities have lower productivities and thus are paid less. So again, pretty amazing study in how they can objectively measure the productivity and the decisions that people make and how these decisions differ based on whether they are officiating someone of their own race versus someone who is of a different race than them. Okay, so why might competitive markets remove discrimination? Well, in some instances, the motive for profits provides a very powerful countermeasure to discrimination. So how might this work? So let's say that some firms discriminate against female workers, and they're going to hire more female workers than they'll hire fewer female workers and more male workers. So what does that do? Well, in the market for female workers, we're going to see the demand curve shift in. In the market for male workers, we're going to see the demand curve shift out. So what we see then is a wage differential. So here is the wage for women, and up here is the wage for men. Well, now what's going to happen? Well, if there are firms that are non-discriminating, then they can hire females for a much lower wage than males. Thus, they earn more economic profits. So, what happens in the long run when firms are earning economic profits? More firms will enter. So we'll see more non-discriminating firms enter this market because there's money to be made. As more non-discriminating firms enter the market, that's going to shift the demand for female workers out, demand for male workers in, and we're back to a situation where male and female workers are earning the same wages. So this is how markets can remove a wage differential through the profit motive. So why might markets fail to remove a wage differential or fail to correct for discrimination? Well, this often happens when we see the discrimination at the customer level. So if customers prefer being served by whites rather than African Americans, then that will result in a wage differential because that leads to a difference in the value of the marginal product. So then firms have an incentive to hire white workers, and then that will lead to a wage differential, and the market will not correct that wage differential. It will, make it persist. So this is a case when markets cannot correct discrimination. Sometimes markets cannot correct discrimination because the government is the one doing the discriminating. So the obvious example of this is apartheid in South Africa. In the United States, the obvious recent example is U.S. laws requiring segregation in buses and streetcars, U.S. laws requiring that African Americans and whites not be at the same lunch counter. All of these different laws, make it so that markets cannot remove discrimination. All right, so just to kind of conclude what we've talked about in the past couple of lectures about more topics in labor economics, we saw that a lot of different factors can affect the value for marginal product and equilibrium wages, and we saw how it is difficult to measure discrimination and figure out how much of the wage differential is due to discrimination versus due to other factors. We went over a couple of clever studies that economists have done to find that there definitely is discrimination going on in the labor market. And then we talked about how in some cases markets through the profit motive can correct discrimination, but markets cannot correct discrimination if it is due to customers or if it is due to the policies of governments.